You'll sign the papers, or I'm filing for divorce. My wife said, demanding half of my inheritance. So I let her file. She lost her mind when she found out how much she was getting. So my wife gave me 1 week to put her name on my inheritance, or she'd file for divorce. I just let her file, because what happened next was not what she expected. I'm Zach, 33 male. I own a small snow removal and site services company out of Greece, which is just north of Rochester, New York. Winters we plow and salt commercial lots. Warm months we do hardscape and retaining walls. I've got 3 crews, a bunch of trucks that probably shouldn't still be running, and a payroll that keeps me up at night every other Friday. I started this thing at 24 with 1 used truck and a leaf blower. Nobody gave me a head start. Everything I have, I either built or fixed or argued my way into keeping. It's not glamorous work. You're up at 3 a.m. in lake effect snow, your hands are wrecked, your phone won't stop going off, and the diesel bill alone would make most people quit. But it's mine. I'm good at it. And up until about 6 months ago, I thought the woman I married actually respected that. Turns out I was wrong about a lot of things, but I was really wrong about that. Maris sat across from me at the kitchen table on a Tuesday night and told me I had 7 days, 1 week. She had her hands folded in front of her like she was closing a deal, which, looking back, is exactly what she thought she was doing. She's a realtor, broker associate, technically. She sells houses in Pittsford and Victor to families making twice what we make, and she's good at it. She knows how to read a room, control a conversation, and make the other person feel like the decision was theirs all along. And that night, she was doing it to me. She told me if I didn't add her name to the trust accounts and the LLC documentation tied to my father's estate by the following Tuesday, she was filing for divorce. She said it like she was reviewing offer terms on a listing. No yelling, no tears, just a timeline and a consequence. She even had a printed list of the accounts she wanted access to, organized by institution. Color-coded tabs, highlighted sections. She'd done her homework, or she thought she had. The thing that got me wasn't the demand. It was the presentation. She'd rehearsed this. She had talking points. She referenced equitable distribution under New York law, like she'd been Googling divorce statutes between open houses. She mentioned marital assets acquired during the marriage 3 times in 5 minutes. She even used the phrase fiduciary duty to the partnership, which isn't a real legal concept in marriage, but sounded impressive enough that she clearly thought it was. I sat there and listened, nodded a couple times. I asked her if she was sure. She said she'd never been more sure of anything. Then she leaned forward, tapped the printed list with one finger, and said, "This isn't something we're going to discuss, Zach. Tuesday. Or my attorney makes the call Wednesday morning." I looked at the list, looked at her. Noted. Then she got up and went to the living room to watch a show on her laptop, like we'd just had a conversation about switching internet providers. Here's what Maris didn't know. I'd already talked to Heather Klein 3 times that month. Heather's the CPA who administers the trust and handles the estate's accounting. She'd already walked me through every scenario and told me that what Maris was demanding was legally impossible. Not difficult, not unlikely, impossible. But I didn't say any of that. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after Maris left the room, processing the fact that my wife had just looked me in the face and given me a deadline to hand over money that wasn't mine to give. Money my dad set up specifically so that nobody could ever do exactly what she was trying to do. 7 days. Fine. I could work with 7 days. The thing about running a snow removal business in Rochester is that you learn to plan for storms before they hit. You watch the radar, you stage equipment, you pre-salt the lots, you get ahead of it. Maris just told me a storm was coming, and she had no idea I'd been watching the radar for weeks. My dad, Ray, died 7 months before that kitchen table ultimatum. Pancreatic cancer, fast and ugly. He was 61. He'd spent his entire adult life in the Rochester area, working in facilities management for commercial properties, and quietly doing something nobody in the family fully understood until after he was gone. He bought things, small things at first, a storage unit complex off Ridge Road in the early 2000s when nobody wanted it, a half-acre lot near Irondequoit that he leased to a cell tower company, a duplex in Henrietta that he rented out for 15 years without ever raising the rent more than $50. He drove a truck older than mine and wore the same 3 flannels on rotation, but he was patient, and he let time do the heavy lifting. Most people who knew him, including Maris, assumed he was just a regular guy with a regular job who lived a regular life. That was the point. When he got the diagnosis, he called me, not to cry. He called to make sure I had Heather Klein's number and that I understood what was going to happen when he was gone. He'd set everything up years earlier with an estate attorney, a guy named Harlan, who specialized in asset protection for small family estates. Everything Dad owned was held inside 2 layers. First, a family LLC that owned the actual real estate and lease agreements. Second, an irrevocable trust that owned the LLC membership interests. The trust had an independent trustee. It had a spendthrift clause that specifically blocked any beneficiary's spouse from accessing, claiming, or petitioning for any portion of the principal or distribution. Every dollar that came out was classified as a restricted gift for approved expenses only, not income, not marital property, not divisible in any proceeding. Dad didn't do this because he was paranoid. He did it because he watched his older brother, my Uncle Gene, lose almost everything in a divorce back in 2011. Gene's ex-wife got the rental properties, the savings, half the retirement. He ended up in a one-bedroom apartment eating cereal for dinner at 58 years old. Last I heard, he's working part-time at a hardware store in Canandaigua. He's 72, still renting. Dad never talked about it much, but every time Gene's name came up, his jaw would tighten. He decided it was never going to happen to his kid. He built the structure and never told me the details until the diagnosis, hoping I'd never need it. The estate meeting was 3 weeks after the funeral. Heather set it up at her office. Maris came with me because she assumed she should, and I didn't stop her. The numbers weren't dramatic by Manhattan standards, but on paper, Dad's estate was valued at roughly $1.8 million, mostly tied up in the LLC assets. Not liquid, not a checking account with a comma in it, just property and leases and structures generating steady, modest returns. None of this was grab and spend money. It was built to hold money. I watched Maris during that meeting. She was quiet, but her eyes were moving. She was scanning the documents, flipping pages ahead of Heather's explanation, stopping on the numbers. When Heather said 1.8, Maris's posture changed. She sat up straighter. Her hand found my knee under the table, but it wasn't comfort. It was a claim. After the meeting, in the car, she was already talking about timeline. When does the money transfer? Can we access it this month? Should we look at refinancing the house? We rent, Maris. We don't own the house. I know that, Zach. That's the point. Now we can buy. She started naming neighborhoods, Pittsford specifically. She knew the listings, the school districts. She had a vision fully formed before we'd even pulled out of the parking lot, and that vision was funded entirely by money she didn't understand and couldn't access. I told her it wasn't that simple, that the money was locked in a structure. She nodded, but she wasn't listening. She was already building a life in her head that didn't exist. That was the beginning. And I should have said more right then, but I loved her, so I didn't. The next 4 months were a slow, grinding pressure campaign, and Maris ran it like she was working a reluctant seller into accepting a lowball offer. She didn't scream or throw things. She was smarter than that. She worked angles. She started spending differently. New clothes, not designer stuff, but frequent. Upgraded her car lease without telling me. Started dropping comments about houses for sale in Pittsford, like she was just making conversation. Except every house she mentioned was listed above $600,000. She'd leave her laptop open on Zillow with saved searches filtered by price range, and the minimum was always set to $550,000. Then came the social pressure. She started telling her friends and her family that I was sitting on money and refusing to share it with her. I found this out because her sister Jill called me one night and asked if everything was okay. She said Maris told her I'd inherited over $1 million and was keeping it in a secret account. Jill wasn't hostile about it. She actually sounded concerned. But the fact that Maris was building a narrative outside our house told me everything I needed to know about her strategy. Classic realtor move. Control the listing description before the buyer ever walks through the door. She also started weaponizing social situations. We went to a couple's dinner at her friend's house in mid-January, and Maris waited until the table was full and everyone was mid-conversation to say, loudly enough that every head turned, that it must be nice to marry someone and then find out they think generosity only goes one direction. Dead silence. Everyone looking at their plates. The host tried to change the subject. Maris smiled at me across the table, with that tight little smile she uses when she's testing a boundary. I finished my food, thanked the hosts, and drove home without saying a word. She called me dramatic when she got back. I called it a preview. The host texted me the next day and said they'd rather not be in the middle of things. Fair enough. But that was a couple we'd done Thanksgiving with 2 years in a row. Gone overnight because Maris turned a dinner table into a stage. These people were props to her. Always were. One night in January, I got home late from a salt run. Around 10 p.m., Maris was at the kitchen counter with a stack of paperwork, joint account modification form, beneficiary change requests, trust amendment templates she downloaded from some legal website that had nothing to do with our actual trust structure. She slid them across the counter toward me with a pen on top, like I was a client at a closing table. Just sign these so we can move forward. I looked at the forms, then at her. I picked up the pen, put it in the drawer, and told her I wasn't signing anything she downloaded off the internet. She called me selfish. I called it Tuesday. The forms showed up on the counter again the next morning, and the morning after that. I started putting them in my truck and shredding them at the shop. The week before the ultimatum, Maris crossed a line that made everything personal. She went to my shop on a Saturday morning when only Mason was around prepping equipment for a Monday job. She told him she was picking something up for me, walked into my office, and spent 20 minutes going through my desk. Mason didn't stop her because she was my wife, and he didn't know any better. But he told me about it that night. I drove to the shop and checked. She'd gone through the business bank statements, the vendor invoices, and a folder I kept with printed trust correspondence. She didn't take anything, but she'd taken photos. I could tell because she'd left a document face down that I always kept face up, and the filing cabinet drawer wasn't closed all the way. She thought she was finding evidence of hidden assets. What she was actually photographing was proof that the trust and the business were completely separate from our marital finances. She was loading her own trap, and she had no idea. Monday morning, I changed the office lock, added a deadbolt, and told Mason that Maris wasn't allowed past the front counter anymore. Didn't matter what she said or what excuse she used. He didn't ask why. He just nodded and wrote it on the whiteboard next to the route schedule. The Friday after the ultimatum, I had payroll due. 3 crews, 7 guys total, plus Mason on salary. Gross payroll was about $14,200 every 2 weeks, and I ran it out of the business checking account. I'd been running payroll like this for 6 years without a single miss. In Rochester in January, when you're running plows at 4 a.m. and your hands are cracked and your back is screaming, that Friday deposit is the only thing keeping guys showing up Monday morning. Here's where I need to explain something that's going to make me sound stupid. 2 years earlier, when we were in a good place and I was slammed during a massive storm week, I added Maris as a secondary authorized signer on the business checking account, just for emergency. She was supposed to be able to make a deposit or handle a payment if I was unreachable during a 72-hour storm cycle. She never used it. I forgot it was even set up. Until Wednesday of payroll week, I logged into the business account to verify the balance before the payroll service pulled funds Thursday night. The account was short, not a little short, missing $9,400. I went through the transaction history line by line, and there it was. An online transfer initiated Monday afternoon, routed from the business checking to our joint personal account. The login came from the saved credentials on our shared home desktop. Maris had used the authorized signer access I'd given her 2 years ago to move $9,400 out of my business account 3 days before payroll. I had 2 days to cover a $14,200 payroll with $4,800 left. And payroll wasn't my only bill that week. I had a $2,800 parts invoice coming due. Fuel costs, salt orders. The business doesn't stop running because your wife is draining your accounts. I could not miss payroll. That was non-negotiable. My guys would walk. My contracts would collapse. My reputation, the only thing that keeps commercial accounts calling me back every winter, would be finished. In this business, you miss one payroll and the word spreads faster than lake effect snow hits the thruway. I sat in my truck in the shop parking lot for about 10 minutes after I found the transaction. Engine running, heat blasting, staring at the bank app on my phone, like the numbers might rearrange themselves into something workable. They didn't. So I started making calls. I called Mason first, told him the account was short and what happened. The line went quiet for a second, and then he said, "You missed Friday. Half those guys don't come back. Not next week. Not ever." I know. That's why I'm calling you first. He didn't say much after that. Just asked what he could do. I told him I needed to sell the backup plow, the 2009 Western V-plow on the spare truck, worth about $4,500 in good condition. I listed it that afternoon on a local equipment group for $3,200 because I needed it gone by Thursday. First guy who called offered me $2,000. I said no. Second guy wanted to come look at it Saturday. I told him it wouldn't be here Saturday. The Batavia guy called at 4 p.m., asked one question about the cutting edge, and said he'd be there by 7 with cash. Done. I watched him load it onto his trailer in the dark, knowing my wife had just cost me my only redundancy in the middle of a Rochester winter for leverage in a divorce she was going to lose. Selling that plow hurt. We still had February and March to get through. Next, I called my equipment vendor and asked to delay the $2,800 parts invoice by 2 weeks. He agreed, but slapped on a $180 late fee and told me it couldn't happen again, or he'd put me on prepay only. That would have cost me thousands over the season. Then I logged into the joint account to pull the $9,400 back, except it wasn't all there. Maris had already burned through about $3,000 of it. Attorney retainer, probably. I transferred back every dollar that was left and put it into the business account. Between what I recovered from the joint, the plow cash, And the delayed invoice, payroll cleared Friday morning. Barely. My guys got paid. But I was out a $4,500 plow, I'd burned goodwill with my vendor, and the joint checking was nearly empty. First thing I did after payroll cleared was call the bank, revoke Maris's authorized signer status, change every password, and enable two-factor on every account tied to the business. Should have done that months ago. Lesson learned the expensive way. Maris had already retained a divorce attorney. His name was Cal Wexler. I got served the following Monday, a full day before her own deadline had even expired. She was never waiting for Tuesday. The ultimatum was just a formality. I stood in my shop holding the papers, snow melting off my boots onto the concrete floor, and read through the filing. She was claiming equitable distribution of all marital and quasi-marital assets, including inherited assets received during the marriage. Her estimated value of the contested estate was listed as $1.8 million, and she was requesting no less than $700,000 as her equitable share. $700,000 from a trust she couldn't touch, controlled by a trustee she'd never met, protected by a structure built specifically to stop people like her. I folded the papers, put them in my desk drawer, and called Heather. Discovery started in early February. Cal Wexler came out swinging. He subpoenaed bank records, business financials, trust documents, LLC operating agreements, everything. Heather and Harlan responded with a wall of documentation that said the same thing on every page. The trust is irrevocable, the beneficiary has no legal title or control, and spousal claims are explicitly excluded. But Wexler kept pushing. He filed motions to compel additional disclosure. He argued the trust was a sham, that I had de facto control, that distributions constituted marital income. Every motion got denied or withdrawn after Heather's team responded, but each one cost time and money. My legal fees were climbing, and I was spending hours assembling documents and responding to interrogatories while trying to run a business in the middle of Rochester's heaviest snow season in 4 years. There was 1 week where I drove from a job site to Heather's office, back to a job site, then to a hearing, then back to dispatch, all in the same day. I ate a gas station sandwich in a courthouse parking garage and called it lunch. Something about Wexler's approach didn't add up, though. He referenced things in filings that were oddly specific. Details about my schedule, my habits, where I kept paperwork at the shop. He described the inside of my office once, referencing documents stored in an unsecured filing cabinet in the respondent's commercial workspace. That's a weirdly specific detail for a man who's never set foot in my shop. He also referenced a vendor payment schedule that matched our actual billing cycle almost exactly, not an estimate. The actual dates. Either Wexler had a forensic accountant going harder than Discovery required, or someone was feeding him information directly. Then one Thursday evening in late February, Mason was finishing a late salt run on a commercial lot in Henrietta and saw Maris's car parked at a restaurant on East Henrietta Road. Except when he swung back past the same lot an hour later on his return route, Maris was standing in the parking lot next to a dark sedan. The guy she was with had his hand on the small of her back while she leaned against the passenger door. Mason said it wasn't the posture of two people wrapping up a business meeting. He didn't think much of it until the following Thursday. Same restaurant, same time window. This time Mason pulled into the lot to check a route notification on his phone and got a clear look. The guy walking Maris to his car was Cal Wexler. Mason recognized him from the preliminary hearing 2 weeks earlier. Same build, same haircut, same watch he'd been fidgeting with the entire time in court. I didn't react when Mason told me. I asked him to write down the dates, times, and what he saw. He did. Then a third piece fell into place without me even looking for it. A buddy of mine named Paul, who does commercial HVAC work, called me the following weekend about a job referral. At the end of the conversation, totally unprompted, he mentioned he'd seen Maris coming out of a law office on East Avenue the previous Saturday morning. Except the office had been closed. Paul knew, because he serviced the building's HVAC system, and the weekend lockout schedule was posted in the lobby. Maris came out a side entrance with a guy Paul didn't recognize, and they got into the same car. I didn't tell Paul what it meant. I just thanked him for the referral and hung up. But I wrote down the date, the time, and what he said. Then I pulled Maris's financial disclosure from Discovery, which included itemized payments to Wexler's office with dates and service description. 6 late conference sessions over a 2-month period, all billed at evening hours, all on Thursdays. The billing matched Mason's sightings down to the day of the week. Who schedules client conferences at 8:30 p.m. on a Thursday? Nobody who's keeping it professional, I told Heather. She went quiet for about 10 seconds. Then she said an attorney in a personal relationship with a client during active litigation has an ethical conflict that could get him sanctioned or disbarred. She asked if I wanted to file a formal grievance. I told her not yet. I didn't want to blow it up prematurely and give Wexler a chance to spin it or withdraw cleanly. Heather flagged the pattern with the court quietly, not as a weapon, as an ethical concern. The kind of thing that makes a judge start side-eyeing everything that lawyer files after that. Wexler didn't know we knew. Maris didn't know we knew. But the ground under their strategy had just turned to sand, and they were still stomping around on it like it was concrete. 2 weeks after discovery started, Maris made her next move, and she set it up like a staging appointment before a listing. She waited until I got home late from a dispatch night after a truck breakdown on one of the routes. She was standing in the kitchen with her phone face down on the counter, and she started in on the trust again. Same demands, same rehearsed calm. But this time, she blocked the hallway when I tried to walk past her to the bedroom. I stopped. I told her to move. She didn't. She asked me if I was going to make her move. She said it loud. Louder than the conversation needed. I looked down and saw the edge of her phone screen glowing. She was recording. She raised her voice another notch and said, "Why won't you just talk to me about this? All I'm asking for is a conversation, and you keep shutting me out." I kept my voice flat. "I'm not doing this tonight. Step aside, please." She didn't move. I stepped backward. I put my hands in my jacket pockets, turned around, and walked out the front door. I sat in my truck in the driveway for 40 minutes until she went to bed. That was the whole incident, but it was enough for Wexler. 3 days later, Maris filed a sworn statement claiming she felt unsafe in the home due to my erratic and controlling behavior regarding finances. Attached was a partial audio clip from that night, starting from where I told her to step aside. Without the part where she blocked the hallway and escalated first, it sounded tense. Wexler also attached a text exchange between Maris and Jill from that same night where Maris wrote that she was scared of what he might do, about 6 minutes after I'd already been sitting silently in my truck outside. New York courts take safety claims seriously at the temporary order stage, and the standard for granting one is low. The judge issued exclusive occupancy to Maris for 30 days pending a hearing. I had 48 hours to gather my personal belongings and leave. I packed 2 duffel bags, slow and quiet. I wasn't going to give her another audio clip. Maris watched me pack from the hallway with her arms crossed. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. I stayed at Mason's place the first week. His wife, Lori, set up the spare bedroom and didn't ask questions. Mason and I ran morning dispatches from his kitchen table. The second week, I moved into the shop. I set up a cot in the back office behind the parts shelving, hung a curtain for some privacy, and used the industrial sink in the equipment bay to wash up. It was February in Rochester, and the shop's heating system was designed to keep pipes from freezing, not to keep a grown man warm at night. I wore 2 layers to sleep and kept a space heater running until the electric bill made me rethink that decision. One morning, a client dropped off a check at 7 a.m., and I had to scramble off the cot, kick the sleeping bag behind the shelving, and get to the front counter before he walked past the office door. I'm not going to lie. 2 a.m. on a cot 6 feet from a rack of plow blades hits different. You built this place. You own it. And somehow you're sleeping in it like a squatter because a woman who blocked a hallway and pressed record convinced a judge you were the threat. That thought sat with me every single night. The snow still falls. The clients still call. One night we had an 8-inch dump that started at midnight, and I was on the phone nonstop until 6 a.m., dispatching crews from a folding chair in a shop that smelled like diesel and cold concrete, rerouting trucks when a driver called in with a transmission issue on Lake Avenue, arguing with a salt supplier about a delayed delivery that was going to throw off the entire overnight window for my biggest commercial account. Mason covered everything I couldn't physically get to, and he never once complained. Meanwhile, Maris was using the time to build her story. She posted on social media about starting fresh and protecting her peace. She told mutual friends I'd been removed from the home because of what he did, leaving the details vague enough that people filled in the worst possible blanks. 2 couple friends stopped returning my calls. My neighbor texted me asking if Maris was okay, and you could tell he'd already picked a side. Reputation damage in Rochester sticks. A small medical office complex in Henrietta that I'd been plowing for 3 seasons dropped us. The office manager called Mason and said they were going in a different direction. No explanation. But the timing lined up with one of Maris's posts about feeling safe again. That contract was worth $4,800. Gone. Mason picked up a replacement account within 2 weeks. A strip mall in Greece. Not the same revenue, but it kept the route schedule full. The hearing on the temporary order happened 3 weeks later. My attorney presented the full unedited audio from the kitchen recording. We'd compelled production of the complete file through discovery, and Maris apparently hadn't considered that the unedited version would tell a very different story than her clipped excerpt. It showed her initiating the confrontation, blocking the hallway, and escalating her volume while I de-escalated and left. It showed the 6-minute gap between me walking out and her texting Jill that she was scared. The judge vacated the order. I moved back into the house that weekend, but I didn't unpack much. This wasn't my home anymore. It was just a place where two people avoided each other until the lawyers sorted it out. Mediation was held at a neutral office downtown. Bad coffee, long table, fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look exhausted. My side was me, Heather, and Harlan, the estate attorney. Maris's side was her and Cal Wexler, who walked in looking like he already knew how this was going to end, but hadn't told his client yet. The mediator started with assets. Wexler presented Maris's claim for equitable distribution of inherited assets valued at $1.8 million. He spoke for about 5 minutes, referencing New York domestic relations law, arguing the inheritance was received during the marriage and had been used to support the marital lifestyle. Then Heather opened her binder. She walked through the trust instrument, irrevocable structure, independent trustee, spendthrift clause, spousal exclusion provision. She explained that the LLC interests were owned by the trust, not by me, that I had no legal title to the underlying assets, that every distribution was a restricted gift administered by the trustee, not marital property under New York law. Wexler tried to pivot. He argued that the trust distributions had effectively subsidized our household expenses, which meant they'd been functionally commingled into the marriage. Heather pulled a ledger showing every trust disbursement for the past 3 years. Each one went to a restricted account managed by the trustee, earmarked for pre-approved categories. Not a single dollar had ever touched our joint account or any account Maris had access to. Nothing was commingled because nothing was ever mixed. Wexler shifted again. He argued that I had de facto control over the trust because I made requests to the trustee about which bills to pay. Harlan shut that down flat. He explained that requesting a distribution is not the same as controlling assets. The trustee had sole discretion to approve or deny. 2 requests had actually been denied in the past year. I didn't control anything. I asked and someone else decided. Then Wexler tried the lifestyle argument. He said the trust's existence allowed me to maintain a lower personal income on paper, while the trust quietly covered major expenses, which artificially suppressed the marital asset pool. It was his strongest point, and you could see Maris perk up a little when he made it. But Heather had the numbers ready. She showed that my declared personal income from the business, separate from the trust, covered our rent, groceries, utilities, and joint expenses. The trust's restricted disbursements went to things like my truck insurance and equipment-related costs. Nothing that benefited Maris or the household. Heather set her pen down after the last rebuttal and said, "To be direct, the beneficiary does not own these assets. The trust does. There is no marital interest here. There is nothing to divide." Wexler leaned back in his chair. He stopped flipping through his notes and said, "I think we've covered the trust issue sufficiently." That was him folding. Everyone in that room knew it. Maris was looking at him, waiting for the next move, and he wouldn't look back at her. That's when I knew he'd been carrying her confidence this whole time, feeding her a version of events where the trust would crack under pressure, and he just watched it not crack. Maris leaned over and whispered something to him. He shook his head once, barely perceptible. She whispered again, more insistent. He put his hand flat on the table and said, quietly but loud enough for the room, that they'd need a moment. The mediator gave them 5 minutes. When they came back, Wexler's tie was loosened a 1/4 inch, and Maris's eyes were red. Not crying, but you could tell somebody had just explained reality to her for the first time. The mediator reviewed the documents. He asked Harlan a few technical questions. Harlan answered them in the same flat tone he probably uses when explaining property tax assessments. Then the mediator asked Maris directly what marital assets she believed were subject to division. She looked at Wexler. He said nothing. The joint checking account balance when the settlement figures were calculated was $6,824. Maris's half was $3,412. She was also entitled to half the value of shared personal property, some furniture, a TV, kitchen stuff. No real estate because we rented. No retirement accounts of real value. My business was a sole proprietorship, and its net value after equipment depreciation and liabilities was negligible on paper. The trust assets were off the table entirely. Maris stared at the number, $3,412. She'd spent months planning for $700,000. She'd quit selling houses for 2 months to focus on the divorce. She'd drained my business account, gotten me removed from my home, torched my reputation with half our social circle, and retained an attorney she was spending Thursday evenings. All of that for $3,412 and half a living room set. The room was quiet for a long time, and Maris was doing something I'd never seen her do in 4 years of marriage. She was sitting completely still. The woman who always had a next move, who always had something to say, had nothing left. She'd been counting on $700,000 for months, and now she was staring at the real number, Settlement was finalized 4 weeks later. Maris walked away with her half of the checking account, her car, her personal belongings, and a share of the credit card debt she'd run up. She asked for temporary spousal support. The judge denied it, noting she was a licensed broker associate with an active license and no documented inability to work. I didn't walk away clean either. Legal fees totaled just over $11,000. I lost the backup plow. My vendor relationship was strained. I'd spent 3 weeks sleeping on a cot in my own shop and lost a commercial contract because of rumors. I lost weight. I wasn't sleeping well. Mason carried more than his share to keep things running, and I owe him more than I'll ever be able to pay back. I did give Mason a raise, effective the first payroll after the settlement cleared, 10%. He tried to talk me down, which is the most Mason thing I've ever seen. I also found out later that during those 3 weeks at the shop, he'd been picking up my route callbacks on his personal phone so clients wouldn't know anything was off. Told them I was handling a family situation and would be back in touch soon. Covered every single one. He never mentioned it. Lori told me. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, I was at the shop on a Saturday afternoon doing equipment maintenance with Mason. We were pulling a hydraulic cylinder off a plow frame when I heard the front door open. I wiped my hands and walked out to the front office, and Maris was standing there. No appointment. No call. Just standing in the doorway with a manila folder in her hand, looking like she'd practiced this in the car, but wasn't sure it was going to work. She said the bank was refusing to process the removal of her name from the business line of credit she'd been attached to as a spouse guarantor. She needed my signature on a release form. Without it, the obligation showed on her credit report, and she couldn't qualify for a new apartment lease. She set the folder on the counter and slid it toward me. She started explaining the urgency, using my name a lot, the way she does when she's working someone. Then she said, "I need this handled by Monday, Zach. I've already lost 2 apartments over this. If it doesn't clear, I have nothing lined up." She said she knew things got messy. Then she said something that almost made me laugh. She said she always believed in what we had. I looked at the folder. I looked at her. She was doing the thing she always did. Reading the room, adjusting her pitch, finding the angle. Except the room was a shop that smelled like hydraulic fluid, and the person she was pitching had already closed that account permanently. I picked up the folder, closed it, and set it on the edge of the desk. "Send it to Heather. She'll process it if it's appropriate." Maris opened her mouth to say something else. I turned around and walked back into the equipment bay. Mason was already back under the plow frame. He didn't look up. He didn't ask. I picked up the wrench and got back to work. I heard the front door close about 30 seconds later. After we finished the cylinder job, I drove out to the cemetery where my dad is buried. I stood there silently for a while. I didn't need to say anything. He'd already said everything that mattered years ago. Guys, we are so close to hit 100,000 subscribers on this channel. If you are not subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing. It really helps hit that 100,000 mark. Thanks for making this dream come true.